So a couple weeks ago during the 12th annual Breckies, we shared our love for The Whale, which still go see. It's one of the most devastating things I've ever seen on a fucking screen. Mm-hmm. But we talked about The Mummy. Or we've talked about that sort of loosely in the preamble before the show. Because of Brendan Fraser. Right. As being sort of the best action adventure movies ever made. Mm-hmm. And that director who wrote and directed those movies, he did one more sort of in that pantheon of big fantasy-ish action adventure movies.
Movie, yeah.
Right. And that was Van Helsing, starring Hugh Jackman and Kate Beckinsale.
Yeah.
And Maggie had never seen it, so we wanted to watch it, and we wanted to do an episode about it. So, of course, we watched it last night pretty late. And
in my old age, I couldn't handle it.
I was nudging her through the entire thing.
I was so sleepy.
Every time I looked, during like rollicking, extremely loud action sequences, I would look over and her head would be lolled to the side.
You'll have to understand, I don't usually fall asleep in movies. I think it's incredibly disrespectful to fall asleep during a movie. Mm-hmm. I've never seen this movie before. I was so excited, and it was like everything about it I was loving, but I just couldn't stay awake through this movie. It wasn't the movie's fault. It was just bad for me. So I have nothing to say about this movie because I watched maybe 10% of it.
Which makes it difficult to do an episode on it when we have 1.5 hosts.
Right. But you know who did watch this movie and will have plenty of things to say about it?
Who watched the movie?
Oh, that is our friend Tristan, who's sitting right next to me. Here you go, Tristan.
Never fear, audience, dear listeners. I've got us on this one. This is picking up the slack that Maggie is leaving in her wake.
It'd be great if you could just appear here every time one of us wasn't fully prepared.
Oh, yeah. Just swoop in.
This is the first time we've ever had Tristan recording with us in person, so we're very excited. Van Helsing, we have notes, we have our normal thing that we're going to get into, but I wanted to start with talking to Tristan about this movie because it seems to mean a lot to him. And when we were watching it, it felt like he'd seen it 1,000 times. He was so excited to share it. What is special about this movie compared to other fantasy action movies you've seen?
All right, so this movie came out back in 2004. That's at least what Amazon says. And I can remember seeing it in theaters. I watched it with my dad. During this time, this is also on the heels of the first couple of Spider-Man movies. Just a bunch of, there's like a new wave of adventure movies that are going on during this time. The Scorpion King, if we're talking about The Mummy, right? Just a bunch of like campy action films that came out at the same time. But then this one was special because it had two actors that I had already known previously, being Kate Beckinsale and obviously Hugh Jackman. Hugh Jackman as Wolverine and Kate Beckinsale as the lead in Underworld. So I knew both of them previously, and I liked them in their respective roles. So it was awesome to see them come together in this fantasy setting. I have such fond memories of this movie because it played with that dark gothic fantasy that you don't honestly get a lot of anymore. Yeah. There was sort of a period where those types of films and that genre had a heyday. And that's within 5 years of this movie. So this was to me, this is sort of the culmination of that, the apex of those themes all coming together. And I'm not saying, disclaimer, this is not a great film. You're not going to talk to anybody who's going to tell you this is a great film, right? It is a fun film, and there is plenty of stuff to enjoy in it. And a lot of the effects and the shots still hold up today. But, there's a lot of acting that's subpar. There are a lot of scenes that are just like, what's going on here? It's a horny film.
Yes, it is.
You don't get a lot of sort of the overt sexuality that's in this one.
Right.
And we're not talking sex scenes. It's understood. There is just sexual imagery throughout the entire film, and it's not overt. It's not like drawing your attention to it. It's just there in the background. It's an understood part of the film itself, which is not something that we get anymore. And if we get sexuality in film, it's usually a theme that's trying to be explored.
Right.
It's not just a subtle understanding that you're going to see a movie, you expect to see this in film. Right.
Like sexual tension.
Right.
When you have Hugh Jackman and Kate Beckinsale.
Exactly.
That's all anyone else in the scene is thinking about.
Exactly.
It was nice to see that almost acknowledged.
Yeah.
Because he's so handsome.
And it's a theme that's continued from The Mummy, right? I mean,
yes.
that is such a big part of that film too. But it's more than just being a horny product of its time, right? It's a fun rollick, and it's a great adventure. It lends itself to a video game, right?
Sure.
There actually was a video game adaptation But it's a really fun fantasy exploration that involves Dracula and vampires and werewolves and Frankenstein even. So you get this, universal monster-verse, right? Sort of prototype where you get to see all of that happen. It was, again, it could have been executed better. And Hugh Jackman was still figuring out the whole acting game.
He's a little wooden
at the time, yeah. But I have fond memories of the film just because of when I saw it. Because I would have been 9 years old when this came out. So it really tapped into sort of that fantasy, that I was craving, right? Just sort of a totally different world, being transported somewhere else, monsters and monster hunters, and there's a lot there that just scratched an itch that I had at the time.
When did you? I feel like I had this same epiphany. When did you realize that a lot of the movies you liked when you were a kid are terrible?
Oh God, it's like going to Olive Garden, right? We were just talking about this earlier today, but it's like back in the day, you're when you're a kid, maybe if you have a couple of siblings or whatever, you're not going to Olive Garden all the time, right? It was like an event to go there, because it's a little more expensive than a lot of the restaurants around. So it's like, wow, I'm gonna get some raviolis tonight, and it feels super cool. And then you go there now, 15, 20 years later, you go, holy shit, you want how much for this frozen dish?
Right. Still have frozen.
Yeah. So there's that veneer sort of comes off the older that you get. So I don't know if there was a specific time where you realize those movies were bad. I think it's usually upon a rewatch, if you're really examining it for artistic value. I think that's when most things, because most movies, if you really think about it, don't belong on the pantheon of movies that deserve to be remembered because they were so good.
Yeah. And Maggie and I have had that lately where we watch something that's okay, or it's just, it's not something that's worth talking about on the show. And sometimes things are great and you have nothing to say about it. That happens too. But this one felt provocative in a way that is conducive to conversation. In the first 20 minutes, we were talking sort of loosely as the movie was going. One of us said that we felt like this was almost a period piece, being a fantasy movie from the early aughts.
Yes.
Because that era, in just the couple years around 2004 when this came out, you had the Lord of the Rings movies, the Harry Potter movies at their peak, and Pirates of the Caribbean.
Yeah.
And I think those are the precursors to this movie.
Oh, yeah. Those are huge IPs that continue to have legs today. And I don't think this exists without things like that. And if you remember the Brothers Grimm movie, right? That is another sort of gothic fantasy that, dealt with your heroes sort of going up against these weird, fantastical creatures. And you have your hero trying to surmount these odds of going up against this creature or these creatures or this group that way outpowers them, and so they have to figure out what's the ace up their sleeve, or how do you overcome this seemingly impossible challenge.
Yeah, and for all of those movies that are influenced by those kind of legends of that era, very few of the movies that follow feel like those. They're influenced, but there's none of that spark or magic. This movie had that spark. There's this confidence, passion. We talked about production value while we were watching.
Yes.
I mean, it feels like a golden era now, those early 2000s of special effects.
Yeah. And I mean, even talking about Underworld, right? Underworld, Sleepy Hollow as well. There was honestly, if you just think about Bring Me to Life by Evanescence, that is that song sort of encapsulates the aesthetic that a lot of the fantasy films had at the time. They were just darker. But more than that, in a broader scope of things, they were also earnest.
Yes.
The actors playing in the film were really trying their damnedest to be authentic in the role.
Yeah.
They were clearly not embarrassed about what they were doing.
Right.
And it's more genuine. The performances are more genuine there because there's not this sort of embarrassed. It's not an embarrassing thing that they did these movies at the time, right? These were done like from the heart, right? Because it was like they were really throwing their backs into these roles, right? Kate Beckinsale has a Transylvanian accent throughout this entire film, and she's giving it her all. You know, and you know, Hugh Jackman is so earnest in his role.
Sure.
As you know, but now after the Marvel effect, right?
Yes.
You know, you can't really have that. It's either a movie is campy or it's serious, but it has a lot of intentionally funny or jokey parts to sort of undercut that serious nature so that it's not too self-serious. But then in doing that, it sort of becomes inauthentic and that it pulls you out of the experience because you know that those jokes are only for the audience because those characters are not saying that.
There was nothing self-referential about the script. Like the script was as earnest as the performances.
Yes.
And even just the four of us on the couch watching this thing, the special effects are so good. I think they used some of the technology that had just been kind of pioneered for Lord of the Rings.
Absolutely.
Which is why, for example, Jekyll and Hyde looks so good as this huge giant hulking in the shadows. It still looks great. I've seen much worse CG in the last few years, and this is from 2004.
Absolutely.
In the same way, Shelob holds up amazingly from Lord of the Rings. Harry Potter still looks great. Something just worked in that era.
And this is 20 years ago. You know,
yes,
like, you know, the biggest like CGI flub that I can think of in recent memory is the live action Mulan film. Right? I don't know if you guys ever watched that, but I saw that one. I probably pirated it or something because there's no way I was paying $30 to Disney Plus to see that movie. I don't know when I saw it, but anyway, there's a scene there where there's just obvious CGI, and it was so bad for like 2020 or 2021 when that came out. But this, it's like, you know, it's a product of the time, so you know there's going to be some shortcomings. But by and large, it holds up.
Yes.
The werewolves in this film
incredible,
are really cool looking, and they're the first one that and Underworld are the first times that I can recall seeing, you know, believable and scary werewolves in film. They were hulking. You know, they're menacing creatures. They move really fast, and they just look vicious.
They almost act like bears a little, which gives them more of a humanoid presence.
Yes.
Because I enjoyed the things you were pointing out through the movie, because I'd seen it, but I forgot the finer points. But I loved the things that stood out to you, like the practical sets or the costumes, because it all felt inspired in a way that we've, you know, on and off the mic complained about modern fantasy, where you have this sort of budget streaming show audience getting, you know, cardboard backgrounds and like Instagram filters over every scene. There's just something different in the way fantasy was done in this era that made a movie that isn't fantastic feel glorious now.
Yeah. It's the same reason. So like, cartoons, right? Like DC has a big animation wing where they'll do like one-off movies about some sort of a comic book storyline, right? And those aren't usually, you know, super high quality in terms of, you know, a film, right? It's not going to win any awards. It's not going to the Golden Globes or the Oscars, but they're usually a lot of fun because in those little projects, they feel more intimate because the writers and the team creating the whole thing don't feel like they have all of the constraints that a bigger budget, broader audience film has to have.
Sure.
So they get away with more stuff that feels like, ooh, I wouldn't see this in like, a Marvel movie in the theater, right? It's not so watered down to be accessible to everybody. You know, you'll get references to other, you know, comics, or like someone will say something that's really off color. You're like, oh shit, you know, how could they say that? Or there's like sexual tension, right, between characters that you don't really get because we've got there's been like a neutering of sexuality in film recently, and I understand why, right? Because there's been a lot of public backlash against the way that industry and the arts and people in the public eye have handled sexuality. But that doesn't mean it needs to totally be gone. And this movie does a great job of feeling intimate in that way, and like you're getting to see something that's unique. Like you're an onlooker getting to view all of this. And I don't know. It's just a product of its time, I think, for better and worse. But there are a lot of aspects to it that movies today could use, because at this time, we're looking at what the biggest movie in the theaters right now is Avatar 2.
Yeah.
Right. And it took 15 years of development. And the only reason people are going to see it is because it's this CGI spectacle.
I think it's the sexual tension.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Put my ponytail on your ponytail. So, there's a lot to be said for a romp of an adventure that doesn't mean much outside of the experience that you're viewing at the time.
Mm-hmm. It reminded me a little bit, that sense of fun, I think, is key to this movie. But there was also a restlessness where we were 20 minutes in and we had blown through, almost all of the major characters. We'd gotten the whole Frankenstein story, the Dracula introduction, the Wolfman introduction, and the whole Jekyll and Hyde scene in about 10 minutes. It felt like the first Star Wars movie that we just talked about last month, where there was such an excitement to share this world with you. Yep. There was that excitement of invention. We talked about the rule of cool, lightning and crossbows and electricity, and every scene was just sparking in this, where I was so excited to turn the next corner. And we paused it at one point, and I couldn't believe we were only half an hour in, because I felt completely rooted in this world.
They packed a lot of scenes in here, and in each scene sort of covered a lot of ground. That's sort of one of the things that makes this an adventure film to me, is that you get to see so many different sort of set pieces and areas where our characters get to visit, and where they carry out activities and things like that, and have fights, essentially go on sort of excursions, quests, or whatever, that are one-off but still are part of the plot. It just really felt like you're with that crew while they're on this adventure.
And pacing has shifted, I think, in the decades since, because I was trying to think of great fantasy that the three of us have sort of loved and talked about on this show that came out in the 2010s, to see how this germ evolved after these franchises ended. And the things I like from that decade are like The Witch and The Shape of Water. Things that are much slower and more esoteric or dystopian or art house.
Yep.
But we haven't had blockbuster fantasy in a while at this level.
Yeah, and it's hard because there has been a gulf created for the mainstream entertainment, right? Like you were just saying, you've got art house films which sort of have more clout, or have more artistic integrity. And then that's one extreme. And then the other extreme is the superhero film.
Right.
Which is watered down to basically not saying anything. They don't have anything to say. They're pure spectacle. And you're expected to be invested in a multi-dozen film, timeline. And so what I think that does is ruin sort of the reason for going to see that one movie in the first place, because it's supposed to fit into a bigger piece, a bigger puzzle. So it's like it undercuts the value of that individual film.
Right. It's like an episode.
Yeah. So it's like I don't know. It's like collecting the Monopoly pieces from McDonald's, right? You buy a meal and you're gonna get a piece that you're putting towards a larger thing, right? Or like the toys in cereal. You buy that thing and you know that you're going to get one piece that leads to the bigger prize or the bigger puzzle, whatever. That's sort of what's happening with those films, and why I'm totally and wholly disinterested in like the Marvel universe at this point.
Sure.
It's just not doing it for me anymore, because why am I going to go see that movie when the whole point of that movie is to make me and tee me up to come to the next one.
But those should be the fun action adventure movies. Like, I was searching fantasy action. I was trying to get all these keywords for these decades to see what the forebears and then the successors were to a movie like Van Helsing. Mm-hmm. And it was all of these movies that made billions of dollars that I don't care about. Mm-hmm. And I care about this movie. It gut me. And I was thinking about modern Star Wars movies, even the Hobbit films didn't engender the same sort of passion in people. The whole Marvel thing, there's a charm and style that isn't there anymore. Mm-hmm. And like the thing that has most electrified Maggie and I in the last couple months is Terrifier 2, which we talked about on that. And that movie was made for $250,000, which is nothing for a movie.
It's huge.
Especially the practical effects that movie had. And I feel like movies now are either made for $20 or made for $200 million. Mm-hmm. And Van Helsing feels like one of those right down the middle movies. And I think fantasy thrives in that sweet spot.
Well, absolutely, because the times that I can recall going to the movies and just munching on popcorn and Skittles or whatever, my most fond memories are during this era, right? As being about 10, right? Late middle school. I mean, late elementary school through middle school, when you can sort of be wowed or be filled with like the wonderment that you're being presented with, because it's easier for you to suspend disbelief, right? And they weren't trying to set up these gigantic, valuable IPs. Mm-hmm. They were just telling stories.
Right.
It was one-offs. It wasn't a commitment. You didn't have to involve yourself in this ecosystem.
Yeah, homework.
You didn't have to go watch all of the deep dive YouTubes to figure out, what the hell's actually going on. What's all the backstory that they didn't actually tell us in this film?
Right.
That now somehow is supposed to amplify the experience that we had. Like the movies don't stand on their own anymore.
You have to watch a Disney Plus show to understand who the protagonist is.
Here's the background series that we filmed on the filming of this movie.
Yeah, and this movie works as a standalone. Mm-hmm. You get all the characters we talked about, whether it's Dracula, Frankenstein, the werewolf, even side characters they play with, Jekyll and Hyde, and these other villains, some of the church figures they play with. But it works as a standalone movie. It wraps up nicely. And there's obviously more they could play with. Yeah. Going through the other Universal horror movies, characters, creatures, you could play with those, but this movie did very poorly. Mm-hmm. It didn't make much money, and it was reviewed terribly. So in the couple days after the movie came out, they scrapped all those plans. But as someone who's seen the movie a bunch and thought about it a lot, where would you have wanted them to go? Like, is there anything you'd want them to have played with in a sequel?
So, I mean, the movie definitely leaves itself open to a sequel, right? And I mean, the way that it was set up, it's that Van Helsing is just on a mission to deal with all of these fantastic, creatures who are posing problems to, around the world. Mm-hmm. And this is during the 1880s is when it's supposed to happen. Right. So you've got that whole, the Brotherhood of, what's that? The one with Sean Connery, the
League of Extraordinary
Gentlemen, right? It's basically the same era as that, and you're dealing with like what's effectively a superpowered protagonist. Mm-hmm. He has all these weapons and gadgets, and he can go toe to toe with these creatures. It's not ever a sure thing that he's going to win. It's always it taxes him, but the show or the movie sets itself up to be episodic in that way, where I don't need continuity. I don't need you to continue telling the same story. I can get another piece of this saga with the same players, but in a totally different environment. And I don't need it to talk to the first one. I don't need it to be a continuation of that story. I want to continue to see Hugh Jackman as Van Helsing doing his whole thing.
Because this is a gothic horror setting, and all of those villains, like Dracula and Frankenstein and all that, those go back to the Universal horror movies. That's where they began their sort of cinematic life. And a couple years ago, they remade The Mummy, a totally different tone, with Tom Cruise, and that was meant to launch Universal's new dark universe, where they were going to make a bunch of those movies with all those characters individually. But I think that first movie had that sequel baiting attitude of, well, you're going to get one, and then you're going to get another creature and another creature. And I was so blown away that 15 minutes into Van Helsing, I'd met everyone that franchise would have touched in 10 years of making movies.
Yes.
So you could have had 2 of these movies, Van Helsing, or maybe a trilogy, and you could have covered every single creature.
Yeah.
Because of the rate that they were burning through them. I tried to just sort of spitball ideas they could have played with. The way the movie ends with a spoiler, Kate Beckinsale's character having died, where she's sort of the co-lead, there's the sexual tension that they don't play with or resolve enough to be done with that storyline.
Yeah.
Also, she was a very bankable star at the time. I feel like you could have done a Pirates of the Caribbean 3 sort of dive into the afterlife or the underworld to rescue her.
Yeah, yeah.
Which means you could play with demons. And there is such a religious undertone in the movie.
Because he's like sort of empowered by the Vatican.
Yeah, you meet like cardinals and stuff that are, I mean, the movie almost feels James Bondy.
Yeah.
Where you meet the guy who gives you all the cool gadgets we're going to use.
Yeah, and Basil comes along with you.
Yeah, and it's which is a great riff on that formula, which again shows that we're borrowing from the action-adventure genre as much as we're playing with anything in the world of fantasy. But you could have played into that religious backdrop more and the Vatican connection and maybe had a second movie with demons and the devil and hell and secret societies, and that would have involved the sidekick.
We're also
monk.
leaving out Hellboy. Hellboy was very much in this vein
in that
at
era.
the same time, right? And so, Guillermo del Toro, sort of being the figurehead for this sort of aesthetic that we're talking about right now. I think if to get a better idea of what we're discussing and what we're seeing the praises of, that's the best example. Who is still making content that's still getting published out there, right?
He's almost a subgenre now.
Yeah, exactly, on his own. And it's just because he's sort of the champion of this sort of stuff,
right?
This dark fantasy. But I don't know. It's just kind of a shame that we didn't get more of that, because it's just such a unique. It's such a unique experience and aesthetic and environment that they play with that you don't really see. You're not just gonna stumble upon this, right? So making it come to life in a movie form was really unique, and it's just. I feel like there's more room for that because what we've got now, it has to launch $1 billion franchise,
right?
Or it has to be a one and done art house film, that is it's the same thing, just on the other end of the spectrum, right? Now, when they unleash new IPs, you expect. Like if they're worth a lot of money, you're gonna get 4 or 5, regardless of whether or not you enjoy it.
Right.
But then if it's an art house film that you really, really like, the expectation is you're never gonna get another one of them.
Right.
So both of those are tough.
And if you made this now, you'd have one bad guy.
Yes.
You wouldn't have the 12 that they play with,
because you don't want to get rid of all of the fodder for ideas.
But there are so many, even just within the limitation of the universal monsters that they could have played with. You can't really do the Mummy, since this guy already made the Mummy movies. You could have Creatures in the Black Lagoon. You could do the Invisible Man. There's such a arch European setting that we're playing in. You could go into an occult aristocracy, do like a Phantom of the Opera.
Yeah, and I mean you could do a hybrid, the Batman / Sherlock, right? Where Van Helsing is that character, because a Jack the Ripper sort of
totally
scene or episode.
There's such an interesting half this conversation's about the kind of movies that get made now, and I feel like there's a weird phenomenon developing where it doesn't matter if the original movie didn't do well. If there's already been a movie, then it's a franchise and we can safely make another one.
Absolutely.
So in a world where Hugh Jackman is still a huge box office star, and I feel like he got more accreditation for something like Logan than he ever has in his career. And now he's going to be in the next Deadpool movie as a full co-lead. I feel like they could make another one of these. And he's a much better actor than he was then.
Absolutely.
Even things like Les Mis. He's real now.
But what I'm saying is, as much as I would love to see that, I don't think they make this movie.
Only if it's if this writer and director.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I don't know that his movie this way that we saw gets made again, because there's so many fun elements, right? That sort of form the heart of the film, between the tension between the leads, the willingness to show and not tell, because what we noticed throughout a lot of this film is that the transitions, whenever characters are transforming into a monstrous form, or from a monstrous form back to a human form, the camera did not shy away from showing that. Right? They did not hesitate to spend budget, like really giving you the visual, appeal and like telling the story that way. Seeing all of this stuff happen, which was really cool, and it's part of the reason why the effects still hold up today, is that they didn't shy away from it at all. They didn't use jump cuts, though they could have in a lot of scenes. So they showed that kind of thing, and the camera lingered on scenes that nowadays we would probably just jump away from. Right. Even beyond the transformations, just little action scenes. A rope swing here or there. Right.
Running, chasing someone. Exactly. And all of that is immersion and tension and atmosphere.
Yep.
For being such a frenetic, restless movie, you're right. It did have the confidence to hold moments longer than sort of the Michael Bay era of action movies would ever play with. This is interesting as a Van Helsing movie. Now that he's in the public domain, there's some sort of Van Helsing story all the time. But I loved watching this movie as a version of the Dracula story, the Frankenstein story, the werewolf mythos, because for being such classic novels and stories and characters, there are very few good adaptations of them.
Yeah.
And this Dracula is not good. No. He's got the brides, he's got the preoccupation with children, he's been alive forever. You really get a sense of that patience. I liked that. And you see his freaky bat form. But at no point did he feel like a count creeping around a castle.
No.
And then maybe that's difficult with a claw clip.
Yeah.
And he didn't have that Jonathan Harker foreplay or one-on-one talking. But did you think this was good as a version of Frankenstein or the werewolf or Dracula?
I think it's a great version of werewolf.
Yeah.
Right? Because just what they were able to do with that and the way that they looked and how vicious they are and how powerful they came across as being, that was really cool. I think it's a bad Dracula adaptation. I think it's a cool vampire adaptation, though, because his wives, you see a lot of them transformed like into their vampire form,
right? But
even outside of it, they have these cool powers, like their eyes will light up whenever they're making like specific points or making like a pointed threat. They can like just vanish out of existence and then pop up somewhere else, and like it always keeps you guessing as to where they're going to be. They're also hot, it's these elements that I'm talking about that you're not going to it's maybe reductive, right? Because these characters could have been given more depth than they were. And that's part of the reason why I say this movie doesn't get made today, is because if you're going to have those characters, anybody who's, a test audience is going to be like, what the hell are they here for other than, their cleavage is out.
But he has a harem of wives. There is a sexuality to the Dracula story. And sort of to cross streams here, in the most recent Witcher episode we did, the character who's a vampire was talking about the sexuality throughout the vampire mythos.
Yeah.
And how that's part of the scariness of the story. That's the fear of vampires that humans have, is because they're full of sexual metaphors. He was talking about blood sucking and the neck and all these stuff. It's a fun discussion. Go listen to that one. But I love that sexuality is even voiced in modern entertainment as being scary to vampires.
Yes.
And we're talking about how us as humans can get that in the story. I agree that the werewolf is the best part of this movie, because I've seen a lot of werewolf transformations. It's something I think maybe it's our generation, maybe it's who we are and what we like, but all of these gothic bad guys, that's all I want to see on a screen. It's just fun in movies. And the werewolf transformation is usually like, it looks painful, like the bones are getting longer and pushing the skin, and it's kind of stretching everything open as the person turns into the wolf. But this is the only werewolf transformation I've ever seen on screen that looks like a death.
Yeah.
Every time. So it's like the wolf is coming from underneath the human.
The
like
skin.
They're coming, right. So the wolf rips off the skin. They tear off all these chunks and flaps of human skin, and they're birthed out of the human.
Yeah.
But it doesn't look like the Hulk.
No.
I feel like werewolves, it usually looks like, oh, they're getting really angry. They're turning into the angry dog.
Somehow, like, the hair morphs out of their skin.
Right. This looks like a painful death.
Yeah, literally letting the beast within out. right?
Yeah.
Just ripping and tearing him, out into existence.
And within those first few scenes, you see Jekyll and Hyde, who sort of has that same transformation style that the werewolves do. You see him turn back into a small, dead human. Mm-hmm. And I thought that front-loaded the whole werewolf conversation with the idea of a human being trapped within a wolf.
Yep.
Because by the time you see Van Helsing turn into a wolf, it's like you're hitting a superpower in a video game. Like, oh, now he's safe and invulnerable and he can fight the big vampire. But the torture of the werewolf transformation, for such a fun and light movie, I thought they nailed that here.
Yes, absolutely.
And I know there have been other werewolf movies, and this wasn't really a werewolf movie. Mm-hmm. But that might be my favorite innovation here.
Yeah, absolutely. And, for being a rollick like it was, just a very much a light-hearted adventure movie, mm-hmm. it did hit some pretty serious story beats between what you were just talking about with the obvious pain of the werewolf transformation to also Dracula being unable, he was able to reproduce, but their issue was that they were never able to keep those offspring alive. Right, and that becomes. It's not just his motivation, it's also his great pain and his great shortcoming, mm-hmm. is that they can't figure that out. He and the wives, right? It sort of humanizes them a bit, mm-hmm. and sort of makes you understand their motivations. And then the for Kate Beckinsale's character, her brother dying and her family being unable. They've sworn this oath of damnation to where the only way their family will be redeemed is if they kill Dracula. Uh-huh. And you've got these underlying motivations that are they punch above their weight in terms of how serious they are, and it gives you enough to hang on to and think about mm-hmm. in this movie. In a self-contained way, not in a what happened in the prequel or what's going to happen in the sequel.
It was self-contained subplots.
Yes.
Yeah. And then after we meet this whole array of characters, when we finally get to settle in on Van Helsing, which you pointed out is the third opening of the movie when we meet him, he is, and I'm describing him in a vague term to point out the comparison, we meet Van Helsing as a gruff, aging monster hunter with a silly jester sidekick and a brunette femme fatale.
Mm-hmm. That's
so.
Fair.
That's when I realized that this is a funhouse version of a Witcher movie. And I don't mean that it is anything like the characters or Sapkowski's stories, but it's remixing classical fantasy and horror without the philosophical curveball magic that Sapkowski brings to it. This is a fascinating American interpretation of that story. With that same setup, how would you veer off and play through the world? And I love that almost as a what if, because it becomes a swashbuckling epic fantasy version of The Witcher. Mm-hmm. The Witcher certainly isn't any of those things. With a Rocky Horror style villain.
Yes.
It's so campy and goofy with that almost American impatience, the quick pacing we talked about, the rapid immersion, the invention that feels much more like Star Wars than it ever feels like Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
I know we have modern American fantasy, which is usually Game of Thrones, because that's the first thing we've brought to the table, basically since Tolkien was around. But this feels more American than that does.
Yes. I mean, all of these, I think Americans or an American audience is sort of preoccupied with these types of monsters. Mm-hmm. They're not so far out there that it's oh, you could make an art house movie on the Lamia or La Llorona that they made a movie of recently, right? These are pretty well American mainstays in terms. Every Halloween you're going to see all three of these: vampires, werewolves, and Frankensteins.
Right.
Everywhere you go, right? There's going to be a million costumes of everyone. So they I think you're right in calling them out as American pastimes, essentially. That sort of form the tent poles of the reason why we're watching this movie. Mm-hmm. And that's just, it's fun. That movies aren't very much fun often anymore.
Right.
Movies are way more about a certain type of actor is in this movie or a certain actor is in this movie, so it's going to be X type of movie, mm-hmm. right? The Rock is in it, so it's going to be an adventure comedy. Yeah, and you know what to expect because all these characters are just playing themselves. They're just themselves in every movie because they're bankable, right? The studios know that that's who they can put forth and turn a profit on, right? It's not about telling a story.
It's part of the marketing.
Exactly. It's not this epic style, and by epic I mean that in its actual the actual meaning of the term, right? Like going back to what's
the Greeks? Homer,
Greek, exactly, a Greek story, where you have these sort of episodic adventures that if you follow those along, they plot the story as it goes. They push the story further, right? And so the Odyssey is a great example, is the example of that, right? And it feels very much like that when you've got your archetypal hero who doesn't have he's missing some of his memories, right? He's got this plethora of weapons and cunning in order to overcome the issues, and he does that each and every time. It's not easy. He has to figure it out. You see him struggle with it every time, and he might lose something. There's a setback each time that he has to deal with, maybe in later encounters. But it's just fun. It's fun to watch it happen, with the stakes being no higher than this is going on in this movie in this time, and I don't have to worry about
remembering anything.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah, the idea of an epic is interesting. It's such a magic trick in movies, because when I think of Homer, when I think of anything that fits that description, it is exhaustive. It's something that fully explores a world. You have a full arc. You see every realm of the cosmos, and then you come back to the Shire, right? But Lord of the Rings takes 1,200 pages to get through that. And that certainly is an epic, but you can't do that story in 2.5 hours. And this movie isn't even a full 2.5, and you have that epic sense. And I think the defining quality there is scope, because you're right, this would be 3 movies or 4 movies if it came out now, or 2 seasons of an HBO Max original or something like that.
They would have done an entire film on the Jekyll and Hyde, which was just the introduction to Van Helsing in this one.
It reminds me a bit of the way The Witcher is paced, the difference between the short stories and the overall narrative. Because this almost felt like a collection of short stories that wove together. Because in a book, you could have like POV chapters following the Frankenstein's monster, or when the movie cuts away to Dracula. It had all of those POVs and perspectives. There was just a fullness to this world. Maybe to end this on a more optimistic note, that sense of fun that we're trying to define and zero in on, I was trying to think of any modern day successors that achieve that, that sense of fun. And I only came up with a few. You're welcome to add to it. But Mad Max Fury Road was the first one that jumped out, because that is, we jump right into the action. There's the rule of cool, great character designs.
Witness.
Yeah, the color, the excitement, the pacing. It's just a fun, epic movie, even though it's like 3 locations. Yeah. That one feels epic. The Suicide Squad, the latest one from James Gunn. I don't know if you saw that.
I didn't see that one. I saw the first one, which was less good.
I heard. I didn't see that one.
So no, I have not seen the newer one.
It's got like a varied cast, which is sort of a fellowship, and a lot of them hate each other, which is fun in a different way. The interactions are great. The villains are goofy. There are title cards. Like the words will be made out of, blown up bits of people or something. It'll be spelled out across the screen. There's a sense of fun and energy and passion through that movie that was infectious. Yeah. And like you said, I haven't felt that in a while. So even though I don't really care about those characters, that movie was fun. And the third example I thought of was Chainsaw Man, which has fun, stylized violence and adventures. And it's light. Yeah. You mentioned sort of the fluffiness of this story, where you didn't have to keep it all in your head and the subplots. They'd remind you when they came back to it.
Yeah, exactly.
Chainsaw Man has that same accessibility.
Yeah, and it's tough, because everything wants to be heady. Everything wants to be super complex and complicated, and really make you literally do your homework on what it is that you're viewing, and what minor subplot that occurred 13 minutes ago that if you don't pay attention to that, you're not going to understand the rest of the film. That's just not present here. And it's nice to not have that sort of expectation that viewing the film is going to be an exercise, right? You're not coming to the movies to, at least when I go to see a movie like that, I don't expect that every single film I go to see is going to expect mental gymnastics for me just to keep up with what's going on.
Sure.
Sometimes you just want to be mindless.
Escapism.
Exactly.
Sure.
That's sort of what this is about, and that's why I really like that dark fantasy fairy tale setting, is that it really lends itself to that, because there are very few things or ideas in there that are relevant to present day, and I don't have to think about the political ramifications of a decision that they made.
Right. There's not a COVID metaphor.
Yeah. Exactly. Right. And it's really hard to avoid those sort of that kind of subtext.
Sure.
In films these days, and maybe it's just what was the name of the director who
Stephen Sommers.
Stephen Sommers.
Yeah.
So he did this in The Mummy, and maybe it's him. Maybe he has a knack for that because there really weren't any political. You didn't have to bring anything with you to enjoy those movies, and if you did pack any sort of political leaning going to view those movies, chances are there wasn't much in there that triggered you any one way or another.
Sure.
You just got to lose yourself in the atmosphere of that movie. And that's what this one did. It wasn't a good movie per se, but it did accomplish that because I was there.
It was excellent. I think it's aged better. I don't think I would have liked this as much if I was this age seeing this in 2004. I don't know if it would stand out to me. But watching it almost 20 years later, it's like a small miracle because it made one of the things I love about fantasy, as much as I love getting into the politics of House of the Dragon or who lied to who and the palace intrigue, I like to feel like a dork, an absolute nerd. And this movie let me do that because there's a freaky vampire flying at Hugh Jackman and then he's got a machine gun crossbow and it's just... you make noises that you don't choose to. Yes. It's involuntarily, and you're just like, ooh, it's cool. And there was just a coolness to this movie. All the leather and the strappiness and the gold accents, the cowboy hat, the crossbow, the corsets and the daggers.
Yes.
It's just fun.
No one's subverting anything. It just leans so hard into what it is that you respect that because it's like, I get it. I get you're going for it.
Right. It feels indulgent.
Yes.
As much as escapism is another way to describe it, I think there's an indulgence here where it's just gorgeous and fun.
Yeah.
And I feel like the term popcorn movie means something else now. But for me, it means I'm going to have a good time. Because if I'm going to see The Whale or Banshees of Inisherin, I'm not buying popcorn for that. I want
to get some tissues.
Yeah, exactly. I want to buy, I'm going to buy popcorn for a movie that's loud, so I'm not going to be annoying. But also something that's just fun, so I can just eat in this frenzy during this fun thing.
And I mean, it's a good perspective to have to recall that things like Shakespeare, right? We view those as highfalutin now,
right?
But they were the lowest brow comedy that you could have, comedy or drama, whatever it was, that you could have. It played down to the masses.
And to your credit earlier, the horniness.
Yes.
Utterly present in every single Shakespeare work.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because, that is such a huge part of human existence, is that. I mean, there's just no escaping that. For better or worse, that is just a reality. And to totally eschew that, and that's not saying that every single movie needs to be hyper horny, right? That's excessive. But, no movies really are now. And I'm not saying that they should be, but actively going against that and pretending like it's not there, I don't know. It's just, you're not living in reality.
You can sanitize it to the point where the characters don't feel like they're interacting with each other in a real way.
Yes.
Where there's not that animal kind of pheromone element. There's this great article I'll put in the description of this episode, and it's about the early Marvel movies, and it's called Everybody is Hot and No One is Horny.
Yeah.
And it's about that sort of dissonance that developed. So this isn't just us riffing. This is something other people have
Okay, thank God.
I like the Shakespeare angle because I don't think anyone's ever compared this movie to Shakespeare, but it has that accessibility and fun because as much as Macbeth might have real political, if you look at when it was made and who it was first shown to and the king, and it might be a metaphor about how he got into power, it's also just cool.
Yeah.
It's cool. It's got the witches and the floating daggers and you get as many ghosts in Hamlet as you do monologues.
Right.
It's just, there's a fun to it that I really loved getting to reconnect with here. So thank you for this recommendation.
Yes.
As much as Maggie hated the movie and completely slept through it. Do you want to come say bye? Sure. Did you like the movie?
I really loved it. The parts that I saw.
The slideshow.
I just need you all to understand it was not the movie. It was me. I really, really enjoyed it. I would love to rewatch it and actually know what on earth was going on, because I just saw, bits and pieces just coming out of my stupor. But it was great. And yeah, that's all I have to add.
Cool.
Kate Beckinsale's character's name?
Oh, I don't
Is
know.
it like Anna?
There you go.
Yeah, it was something stupid like that.
Something stupid.
Just not the name that you would give your 19th century Transylvania adventurer.
Transylvanian. Whatever. The accent was hysterical. I didn't even realize she was doing an accent for 20 minutes.
Yeah, the accent was wild. I do remember that part.
He leaned over and he asked me, he said, has she been doing that the whole time?
Yeah, well, yeah.
It's so much fun.
Thank you guys for letting me carry this episode single-handedly. I did such a great job.
Once again.
I've just been sitting here. Anyway, I have nothing else to add. Here you go.
All right, cool. Well, we will thank you for joining us, Tristan and Maggie, for your little cameo. And we'll be back next Friday for the next chapter of The Witcher. Cool. That's it.
Adios.